Stories. My name is Mindy, and every episode I will be whispering to you about one of my favorite films. We'll talk about the film's background and history, and we'll dive into the film's plot, so there will be spoilers if you have not yet seen the film. Today we're talking about the 1986 film by artist and auteur David Lynch, Blue Velvet. Blue Velvet was more of a concept that David Lynch had been thinking of for many years, and in the 70s started to write something down and make a script out of it. Initially, it was just some ideas, such as a room, the song Blue Velvet by Bobby Vinton, a severed ear. Once, however, he started to write the script, he passed the script around, I think in the 70s and early 80s, but a lot of studios passed on it because of its violence and its darkness. And then David Lynch made Dune, and I don't know how many of you have seen Dune. It's an interesting film. It's been a long time since I've seen it, and I do want to revisit it, but it was not a commercial success whatsoever, and it was an overall bad experience for David Lynch. After the box office failure of Dune, Lynch once again came back to his Blue Velvet script, but again, it was going to be difficult to find a studio that was going to be willing to make it. Lynch got in contact with Dino De Laurentiis. Dino De Laurentiis was an Italian producer. Dino De Laurentiis agreed to finance the film and also not get very involved in the filmmaking, as long as Lynch made an effort to use local talent when making the film on location so as to drive down production costs. Lynch was happy to do so. So in 1985, production began. The cast included Kyle MacLachlan, who had been the lead in Dune and one of David Lynch's muses. If you haven't noticed, if you haven't seen Twin Peaks or Twin Peaks The Return, Kyle MacLachlan is somebody that I think David Lynch sees almost as a representation of himself or an extension of himself, and he uses him in a lot of his work. Isabella Rossellini, Dennis Hopper, Laura Dern, Dean Stockwell, Jack Nance, Brad Dourif, Hope Lang, an incredible group of actors, especially Dennis Hopper, and we will definitely get to him later on. He also hired Angelo Badalamenti to do the score, who is somebody he uses quite a bit. And the score is this sweeping woodwind and string-based melodramatic piece that is almost seems too much, but is yet so fitting. His editor, Dwayne Dunham, and his standard cinematographer, Frederick Elms, to round out the crew. A lot of the other crew members were locals, and on the Criterion collection of Blue Velvet, there's a great extra where they do interviews with a lot of these crew members where they talk about the experience of making this film, and especially like the prop masters and the prosthetics guys. Really interesting stuff that they remember. When the film came out, when it was released in 1986, it had a very mixed reception, and I'm going to wait till we go through the plot to talk about what specific critics said. What is Blue Velvet about? It is about a lot of things, but I don't think it's that difficult to understand it. First of all, it's a neo-noir. It is a dark murder mystery. That is the first element. The second is that it works in a space of dreams and of nightmares. David Lynch, everything he does is based on his relationship to dreams. That is his foundation when creating his work. Some of the script came to him in dreams. That is how versus light. And this is said over and over by characters in the script. It is represented by characters in the film. It is about what happens when you step out of the light and into the dark. And the dark is mysterious, and sometimes the dark is fascinating and alluring, and then you get overwhelmed by it, and you realize you don't want to stay. And that certainly seems to be the predicament of the lead character, played by Kyle MacLachlan, Jeffrey Beaumont. So with that, I'm going to start talking about the plot of the film. This film is quite old, and I really encourage you to check it out. It's available on DVD, it's available online, it's available, I think, right now, like on Vudu, and you could rent it, you can, I think, see it with ads. There are many ways to see this film, but I will tell you that it is a dark film, that it is a violent film, that it is, in times, a terrifying film, and I would understand if that's not your scene. But I think the beauty of it outweighs those moments. But it's definitely not a Disney film. So as the film opens, we see the credits begin against a background of flowing, crushed blue velvet. There's this woodwind string score from Badalamenti, and it's dramatic and tense, and it's telling you that you are going to see something mysterious. And when the credits end, we see the billboard for Lumberton, which is a small town, a fictional town, somewhere in the upper northwest. It's a lumber town. And as we see this, Bobby Fitton's Blue Velvet begins to play, and there's a pan down to a blue sky and a white picket fence and red roses and yellow tulips and a waving fireman on the fire truck and children walking across the street with a crossing guard. We see a man mowing his lawn, and he starts to have issues with the hose, and then he starts to have some sort of medical event, and he collapses on the ground, and as he does this, the dog runs up on him and starts fighting with the hose and gnarling his teeth, and then the camera moves further down the ground till we see an army of beetles clawing at the dirt underneath the grass. Obviously, a little foreshadowing here. And enter Jeffrey Beaumont. He's walking through a field. He goes to the hospital, and he visits the man who we saw earlier, who is his father. On the way back from the hospital, he walks through the same field, and he starts picking up rocks and throwing them. And as he does this, he sees something on the ground. What he finds is a severed ear. He puts the ear in a bag, and he takes it to the police station, and he asks for Detective Williams, who is a friend of the family and neighbor. He tells Williams that he has an ear in a paper bag, and Detective Williams opens the bag and looks at it and says, "Yes, that's a human ear, all right." Police decide to search the rest of the field to find anything further. We see Jeffrey open a door inside a home. He is in the light, but below him is dark, and he enters the dark, walking downstairs. He says he's going for a walk, and as he goes outside in the dark, he walks along the sidewalk. He looks up at the trees, and then we see a close-up of the ear as it scopes inward deep into the center of the ear until it's dark. Jeffrey goes to Detective Williams' home. Williams tells him, understandably, that he can't tell him anything about the case, but that they are working on it. As Jeffrey leaves the house, he hears a woman's voice say, "Are you the one who found the ear?" And he looks into the dark, and out steps Laura Dern, who plays Sandy. A she says her father is surveilling. It's an apartment called Deep River, and it's on Lincoln Street, where Jeffrey's family told him not to go when he was out walking. The next day, Jeffrey picks Sandy up at high school and takes her to Arlene's diner and says to her, sometimes it's necessary to take a risk. With that, he tells her about a plot he has to break in Deep River, that he will be dressed as an exterminator, and that if Sandy could be a Jehovah's Witness and knock on the door to distract Dorothy Valens, the woman in the apartment, while Jeffrey tries to open a door so he can get into the apartment later. When Jeffrey enters the hallway of the apartment building, it's dark and dirty. The hallways are dark gray. He gets into the apartment, but Sandy does not make it upstairs as she is thwarted by a man who is wearing a mustard yellow jacket. He doesn't see her. Jeffrey then steals what he believes are keys to the apartment. Jeffrey tells Sandy that he wants to go back that evening, and Sandy agrees to help him. But first, they go to the Slow Club, which is where Dorothy Valens sings. At the club, Jeffrey says, here's to an interesting experience. Dorothy Valens, called the Blue Lady, begins to perform, and it is clear that Jeffrey is transfixed watching her perform on the stage. While the stage is awash in blue light, Jeffrey and Sandy leave the club to get into the apartment. Sandy tells him not to do this, but he refuses. Sandy agrees to stay until Dorothy returns, and then honk the horn 4 times so that Jeffrey hears it and leaves. And before Jeffrey goes back inside, she says, I don't know if you're a detective or a pervert. And Jeffrey replies, well, that's for me to know, and you to find out. Jeffrey goes into the apartment and starts poking around. Sandy sees Dorothy enter the apartment building and honks, but as she is honking, Jeffrey is using the restroom and flushes the toilet, drowning out the honking horn. Then he hears somebody come in the door, so he runs into the closet in the front room. He watches Dorothy undress and get a phone call from a man named Frank. Then she asks to speak to Don and little Donnie, and she asks Don if he is okay. She sounds absolutely terrified of Frank. She gets undressed and she puts on a blue velvet robe. She feels like something is going on in the apartment, and she finds Jeffrey and holds him at knife point. She demands to see his wallet and get his ID and asks him who sent him there. And she makes Jeffrey get undressed. As he is undressed, there's a knock at the door, and she tells Jeffrey to get back inside the closet. At this point, Frank Booth enters the room. Frank is played by Dennis Hopper. Before I go on about this scene, which is a difficult scene to describe and to watch, I want to talk a little bit about Dennis Hopper's performance and also about the casting of Dennis Hopper. Dennis Hopper had been well known at that point in the industry for having alcohol and drug abuse problems. While he was known as a great actor and a director in the 80s, it was a very low point for him professionally and personally. He had gotten clean and convinced them to take a chance on him to play Frank Booth, that he understood this character, and they did, and later found him to be one of the most professional actors on the set. But make no mistake that Frank Booth, he is evil incarnate. He is the darkness, as we're going to find out. So Frank enters the room and says, now it's dark. He assaults Dorothy while high on amyl nitrate, and Jeffrey watches all of this from the closet. And then he tells Dorothy, stay alive, baby. Do it for Van Gogh. What's interesting is that Frank Booth is dressed all in black, and Jeffrey is dressed all in black. Booth leaves, and Jeffrey runs out to comfort Dorothy. Dorothy starts calling Jeffrey Don and asks him to hold her. Dorothy begs begs Jeffrey to hit her, but he refuses and says he's going to leave. But before he leaves, he finds a photo of what appears to be her husband and son. As Jeffrey walks home, and he walks out of the dark into the light, a montage of images play. His nightmare. Jeffrey briefs Sandy about the night before as they're parked outside a church. "It's a strange world, Sandy," he says. He explains that Frank has kidnapped Dorothy's family in order to force Dorothy to do things for him. Jeffrey says he can't tell her father because he obtained his information illegally and it would get her in trouble. And he says, "Why are there people like Frank? Why is there so much trouble in the world?" And Sandy replies, "I don't know. I had a dream. In the dream, there was our world, and the world was dark because there wasn't any robins, and the robins represented love. All of a sudden, thousands of robins were set free, and there was this blinding light of love. So I guess what that means is there will be trouble until the robins come." Jeffrey returns to Dorothy's apartment the next night and begins a relationship with her. Jeffrey goes to the slow club to watch Dorothy, and he notices Frank sitting across the room weeping as Dorothy sings Blue Velvet. Jeffrey waits outside the club and watches Frank's gang leave and follows them. They stop at a warehouse, and Jeffrey runs in and sees the mailbox for Frank Booth in the building. Jeffrey meets again with Sandy and tells her what he found after casing the warehouse, that he saw Frank with the yellow man. Then the yellow man met with a well-dressed man, that they went into a building, and not far away from the building is a murder scene. Sandy finally asks him how long he's going to pursue this, and asks him why he's still going to her apartment. And Jeffrey replies, and I think this is really the crux of the film here, this statement: "I'm seeing something that once was hidden. I'm in the middle of a mystery. I'm seeing something that once was hidden." When I talked earlier about the darkness and being drawn to the darkness, it can be alluring. Jeffrey then tells Sandy that he likes her and tries to kiss her, but she rebuffs him. Back at Dorothy's apartment, Dorothy tells Jeffrey to hit her, but he refuses. She continues to go after him until he does it, and then we hear the sound of lions roaring, and she says, "I'm not crazy. I know the difference between right and wrong." Clearly, though, she is traumatized, and she expects this treatment. As Jeffrey leaves the apartment, Frank's gang turns the corner in the hallway and sees him. Frank asks who he is and invites him for a ride. Jeffrey refuses, but Frank's gang forces him and Dorothy to go with them, and they speed through town. They stop at a place called This Is It, and the scene that happens next is probably one of the most memorable of the film, one of the most referred to, and one of the most quoted. This is it. It's Ben's bar, and Ben is played by Dean Stockwell in a role that I truly have never forgotten. I know he was in Quantum Leap after this, but it is really hard to have ever looked at him and seen anything other than Ben. Ben wearing white makeup on his face, curly tight hair, and a smoking jacket with a ruffled shirt, welcomes everyone into the room. After a little discussion, Frank Booth gives Ben a tape and says the candy-colored clown they call the Sandman is a lyric from Roy Orbison's song In Dreams, and then Ben begins to lip sync In Dreams, and it is really a stunning scene. Jeffrey is terrified, and it is apparent that Dorothy's family is actually being held in this apartment, and she is allowed to see them. The gang leaves Ben's, and they continue to drive until they get into an abandoned lumberyard. Frank inhales more amyl nitrate and begins to grope Dorothy, and then Jeffrey loses his temper and punches Frank in the face, and they pull him out of the car and begin to beat him up. Once again, Frank has In Dreams put on the tape player in the car, and he says to Jeffrey, "In dreams, I walk with you. In dreams, I talk with you. In dreams, you're mine. All of the time." It seems clear to me, at least, my interpretation of that is that Frank is saying, I am your darkness. I am your nightmare. The next morning, Jeffrey comes to on the ground in the lumberyard. He walks back home, and when he's back in bed, he begins to think about the things he's seen and done, and he begins to cry. Jeffrey talks to Sandy, and Sandy convinces him that he needs to tell her father what's happening. When Jeffrey goes to the police department to talk to Detective Williams, he sees the man, the yellow man. It's a detective who works with Williams, so Jeffrey leaves to avoid him and goes directly to the house with his evidence. Later, Jeffrey comes to the house to take Sandy out on the date, and the yellow man shows up at the door. Detective Williams tells Jeffrey not to get upset, that it's all part of the plan. Jeffrey and Sandy go to a party, and they dance to Julie Cruz's Mysteries of Love, where they kiss and announce that they are in love with one another. As they are driving home from the party, they are followed by a speeding car. Jeffrey thinks it's Frank, but it's actually Sandy's ex-boyfriend, Mike. Mike's car blocks them in front of Jeffrey's house, and as they begin to fight, Dorothy Valens walks out of the bushes, naked and beaten, and she runs into Jeffrey's arms. They take her to Sandy's house, and Sandy realizes that Dorothy knows Jeffrey personally. When Dorothy screams, "I love you, love me," Sandy begins to cry. After Jeffrey goes to the hospital with Dorothy, he talks to Sandy on the phone and asks for her forgiveness, and she forgives him. Jeffrey goes to Dorothy's apartment, and Sandy calls the police to get her father. When Jeffrey shows up to the apartment, the yellow man and Don are there, and they have been killed, and he says to himself, "I'm going to let them find you on their own," and walks out. The police are raiding Frank's warehouse, where a shootout commences. As Jeffrey descends down the stairwell, he sees the well-dressed man walking up and realizes that the well-dressed man is Frank Booth in disguise. Frank realizes Jeffrey is in the apartment because he is using a walkie-talkie, and he also has a walkie-talkie. Frank opens the closet where Jeffrey is hiding, and Jeffrey shoots and kills him. And then Sandy and her father show up at the apartment. After the scene, Sandy and Jeffrey are standing in this dark hallway and kiss, and the hallway turns bright. The next thing we see is a camera pulling out of an ear, but this time it is a living ear. It's Jeffrey's ear. He is relaxing in the backyard, and he spots a robin. Jeffrey's father is well. Everyone is at the house together for lunch or dinner, and everyone is dressed in white or bright colors, except for Jeffrey. Jeffrey's shirt is white with black prints. Sandy and Jeffrey notice the robin on the windowsill. Sandy says, "It's a strange world," and the Mysteries of Love begins to play. The film bookends with the friendly fire truck and the white picket fence and red roses, but adds Dorothy hugging her child as they visit a park, and you hear the last strains of Dorothy Vallon singing, and I can still see Blue Velvet through my tears. It's a pretty simple story. What is provocative about it, and what is controversial about it, is the way it makes the viewer feel because of the darkness that we see. And again, darkness versus light. Jeffrey's compromise, which I believe is his decision to leave the darkness and to stay in the light, even though maybe that isn't exactly what he wanted. It's what he knows is best. And true love. The mysteries of love, really. Now, a little bit about the reception of this film when it came out. Roger Ebert absolutely disliked this film immensely, and his reasoning was that he felt it was very unfair to Isabella Rossellini, that what was asked of her in her performance was egregious. And I totally understand that, to be quite honest. I understand that line of thinking. But, and there's a clip of this on YouTube with where Siskel and Ebert cover Blue Velvet. Gene Siskel basically disagrees with everything that Roger Ebert says, and they agree to disagree like they always do. But Gene Siskel's points are very valid as well, that this is the filmmaker's film, and that everybody who signed on to the film knew the film that they were going to be making, and that bad things do happen, and that's the reality of the situation. There's also a video where the British critic Mark Kermode talks about his first and initial reaction to seeing Blue Velvet, and that it was very visceral, and it was so visceral that he walked out of it, and that decades later he has come to really fully appreciate the film and realize that you can hate and love a film at the same time, but also that the film was making him angry. It wasn't that the film was bad, it was that it was pushing him, and maybe he misinterpreted that feeling as bad when the film was not bad. It was doing what it did. Personally, I first saw Blue Velvet as a teenager, and I was absolutely caught up in it immediately, and I showed it to like everyone I could think of who was willing to watch it. But I had not seen it in a theater. I watched it, I think, or cable or something like that, and then, rented it for the 30th anniversary in 16. They actually did a limited screening in theaters, and I finally got to see it on a big screen, and I am telling you, it was so much more terrifying. But I'm telling you, seeing the film so many times and knowing exactly what was going to happen, and yet being absolutely terrified and disturbed as though I'd never seen this before, was a really fascinating experience. Again, everybody has their favorite Lynches, if they like David Lynch at all. And I know a lot of people love Twin Peaks. A lot of people love Wild at Heart. A lot of people love Mulholland Drive, and those are good films. But for me, Blue Velvet is always going to be the apex. To quote the Rewatchables, the apex mountain for David Lynch. So, with that, I want to thank you again for sticking it out with me. I promise the next episode will be something a little lighter. I can't promise that with everything, though, because I do like weird movies a lot. And as always, if you have any suggestions, if you have any ideas for a movie that you'd like me to cover, if you want to talk about the movie more, if you want to talk about the video or have any suggestions for the video, I am interested in your opinion. So, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you're asleep right now, I hope you have wonderful dreams if you want them, and I hope you have no dreams if you